Aloha everyone. Welcome to CJ 3600 Criminalistics Investigation of Injury and Death. I want to give you a little introduction to forensic science, as this class will cover different types of injuries and different death investigations, but it's also important that we have a foundation. Forensic science, in its broadest definition, is the application of science to law. As our society has grown more complex, it has become more dependent on rules of law to regulate the activities of its members. Forensic science applies the knowledge and technology of science to the definition and enforcement of such laws. Forensic science occupies an important and unique role in the criminal justice system, a role that relates to the scientist's ability to accurately and objectively provide information about the events that have occurred at a crime scene. Forensic science owes its origins to certain individuals such as Bertolone, Galton, Latz, Goddard, Osborne, and Lucard, who developed the principles and techniques needed to identify or compare physical evidence. Primetime television shows like CSI, Crime Scene Investigation, have greatly increased the public's awareness of the use of science in criminal and civil investigations. However, by simplifying scientific procedures to fit the allotted airtime, these shows have created within both the public and the legal community unrealistic expectations of forensic science. In these shows, members of the CSI team collect evidence at the crime scene, process all evidence, question witnesses, interrogate suspects, by which we never see them give them their constitutional rights, carry out search warrants, and testify in court. In the real world, these tasks are almost always delegated to different people in different parts of the criminal justice system. Procedures that in reality can take days, weeks, months, or even years appear on these shows to take a few minutes. This false image is significantly responsible for the public's high interest and expectations for DNA evidence. The dramatization of forensic science on television has led the public to believe that every crime scene will yield some type of forensic evidence, and it produces unrealistic expectations that a prosecutor's case should always be bolstered and supported by forensic evidence, and we know that this is not the case. Forensic science is an umbrella term encompassing a myriad of professions that use their skills to aid law enforcement officials in conducting investigations. The diversity of professions practicing forensic science is illustrated by the different sections provided by the American Academy of Forensic Science, the largest forensic science organization in the world. It includes criminalistics, digital and multimedia sciences, engineering science, jurisprudence, odontology, pathology and biology, physical anthropology, psychiatric, behavioral science, question documents, and toxicology. Even this list of professions is not exclusive. It does not encompass skills such as fingerprint examination, firearm and tool mark examination, and photography. There are several important contributors to the field of forensic science. Matthew Orfila is considered the father of forensic toxicology. Alphonse Bertillon devised the first scientific system of personal identification. This science, known as anthropometry, is a systematic procedure of taking a series of body measurements from an individual, distinguishing them and classifying them as being criminal. For nearly 2 decades, this system was considered the most accurate method of personal identification. Eventually, this theory was replaced by fingerprinting in the early 1900s. Certain areas that were considered was the size of your feet, the size of your reach, the size of your head, the size of your hands, etc. Francis Galton undertook the first definitive study of fingerprints and developed a methodology of classifying them for filing. Leon Latz produced a procedure to determine blood type from dried blood stains. He discovered that blood could be grouped into different categories. These blood groups or types are now recognized as type A, type B, type AB, and type O. The possibility that blood grouping could be useful characteristics for the identification of an individual intrigued this professor. He devised in 1915 a relatively simple procedure for determining the blood group of dried blood stains, a technique that he immediately applied to criminal investigation. Calvin Goddard used a comparison microscope to determine if a particular gun was fired and if that gun fired a bullet. This U.S. Army colonel refined the techniques of such an examination by using the comparison microscope. Albert Osborne developed the fundamental principles of document examination. Osborne's development of these principles was responsible for the acceptance of documents as scientific evidence by the court. Walter McCrone He was a tireless advocate for applying microscopy to analytical problems, particularly forensic science cases. His exceptional communication skill made him a much sought after instructor, and he was responsible for educating thousands of forensic scientists throughout the world in the application of microscopic techniques. Hans Gross wrote the first treatise describing the application of scientific disciplines to the field of criminal justice investigations in 1893. And then we have one of the famous people, and that's Edmond Locard. Locard, a Frenchman, demonstrated how the principles enunciated by Gross and other forefathers could be incorporated with a workable crime laboratory. Locard's formal education was in both medicine and law. During his first years of work, the only available instruments to him were a microscope and a rudimentary spectrometer. He was known throughout the world by forensic scientists and criminal investigators. He believed that when a person comes in contact with an object or person, a cross-transfer of materials occur. This is known as Locard's exchange principle. He maintained that every criminal can be connected to a crime by something as minute as dust particles. The ever-increasing number of crime laboratories is partly the result of Supreme Court decisions in the 1960s, responsible for police placing greater emphasis on scientifically evaluated evidence. The most ambitious commitment to forensic science occurred in the United States with the systematic development of national and state crime laboratories. This development greatly hastened the progress of forensic science. In 1932, the Federal Bureau of Investigation organized a national laboratory that offered forensic science to all law enforcement agencies in the country. During its formative stages, agents consulted extensively with business executives, manufacturers, and scientists whose knowledge and experience were useful in guiding the new facility through its infancy. The FBI laboratory is now the world's largest forensic laboratory, performing more than 1 million examinations each year. Furthermore, the opening of the FBI's Forensic Science Research and Training Center in 1981 gave the United States, for the first time, a facility dedicated to conducting research to develop new and reliable scientific methods that can be applied to forensic science. The oldest forensic laboratory in the United States is that of the Los Angeles Police Department, created in 1923 by Police Chief August Vollmer. A more recent impetus leading to the growth and maturation of crime laboratories has been the advent of DNA profiling, and also the amount of drug specimens due to accelerated drug abuse. Since the 1990s, technology has progressed to the point which traces of blood, semen stains, hair, and saliva residues left behind on stamps, cups, bite marks, and so on have made possible the creation of a system that allows to analyze this biological evidence. Likewise, DNA profiling has become the dominant factor in explaining how the general public perceives the workings and capabilities of modern crime laboratories. The development of crime laboratories in the United States has been characterized by rapid growth accompanied by a lack of national and regional planning and coordination. It has been estimated that more than 411 publicly funded crime laboratories currently operate at various levels of government, which are federal, state, county, and municipal, more than 3 times the number of crime laboratories operating in 1966. There's 5 basic services that provide technical support to these crime labs. The first being the Physical Science Unit, which applies principles and techniques of chemistry, physics, and geology to the identification and comparison of crime scene evidence. It is staffed by criminalists who have the expertise to use chemical tests and modern analytical instrumentation to examine items as diverse as drugs, glass, paint, explosives, and soil. The biology unit is staffed with biologists and biochemists who identify and perform DNA profiling on dried blood stains and other body fluids, compare hair and fibers, and identify and compare botanical materials such as woods and plants. The firearms unit examines firearms, discharged bullets, cartridge cases, shotgun shells, and ammunition of all type. Garments and other objects are also examined to detect firearms discharge residue, in other words, gunshot residue, and to approximate the distance from a target at which a weapon was fired. The documentation examination unit studies the handwriting and typewriting on question documents to ascertain authenticity and/or the source. Related responsibilities include analyzing paper and ink and examining indented writings. The term usually applied to the partially visible depressions appearing on a sheet of paper underneath the one on which the visible writing appears, obliterations, erasers, and burned or charred documents. The photography unit examines and records physical evidence. Its procedures may require the use of highly specialized photography techniques such as digital imaging, infrared, ultraviolet, and X-ray photography to make visible information that is not visible to the naked eye. This unit also prepares photographic exhibits for courtroom presentation. Optional services by full-service labs include the toxicology unit that examines body fluids and organs to determine the presence or absence of drugs and poisons. Frequently, such functions are shared with or may be the sole responsibility of the medical examiner or coroner's office. They detect for drugs and poisons during the investigation, and these tests can sometimes take up to 6 weeks. The latent fingerprint unit processes and examines evidence for latent fingerprints when they are submitted in conjunction with other laboratory examinations. The polygraph unit, or lie detector, has become to be recognized as an essential tool of the criminal investigator rather than the forensic scientist. Many police agencies incorporated this unit into the laboratory's administrative structure, or, as in the Honolulu Police Department, it is part of the Criminal Investigation Division that handles interrogations. Voice print analysis unit, which involves telephone threats or tape-recorded messages, requires skills of the voice print analysis unit to tie the voice to a particular suspect. We see this a lot in today's television shows, such as Ransom, and other times that there's voice recordings or background information. Crime Scene Investigation Unit, or the Evidence Collection Unit, dispatches specifically trained personnel to the crime scene to collect and preserve physical evidence. In the Honolulu Police Department, these are known as evidence specialists, and they all have vast duties: collection of evidence, preparing diagram, submitting things into evidence, preparing displays for court, and then items after they're collected are actually turned over to the crime lab, where we have all the other different people, such as firearms, DNA, drug analysis, who run the actual test on the actual machines. Analyzing physical evidence requires using the scientific method. And this method is, first of all, you have to formulate a question worthy of investigation. You have to come up with a reasonable hypothesis to answer the question. You got to test that hypothesis through experimentation. And upon validation of the hypothesis, it becomes suitable as scientific evidence. One of the three major avenues available to police investigators for assisting in solving a crime are the confessions, eyewitness accounts by victims or witnesses. Only physical evidence is free of inherent error or bias. A forensic scientist must be skilled in applying the principles and techniques of the physical and natural sciences to the analysis of the many types of evidence that may be recovered during a criminal investigation. I hear people say that they want to work CSI. For a lot of people who work in these crime labs, they have degrees in the sciences such as biology, chemistry, physics, which are not required degrees of a criminal investigation. A forensic scientist may also provide expert court testimony. In court, an expert witness may be asked questions intended to demonstrate his or her ability and competence pertaining to the matter at hand. Competency may be established by having the witness cite educational degrees, participation in special courses, membership in professional societies, and any professional articles or books published. Also important is the number of years of occupational experience the witness has had in areas related to the matter before the court. Most chemists, biologists, geologists, and physicists prepare themselves for careers in forensic science by combining training under an experienced examiner with independent study. Of course, formal education in the physical sciences provides a firm foundation for learning and understanding the principles and techniques of forensic science. Before the judge rules on a witness qualification, of course, the opposing attorney gets to cross-examine the witness and point out weaknesses in training and knowledge. Most courts are reluctant to disqualify an individual as an expert, even when presented with someone whose background is only remotely associated with the issue at hand. The expert witness is called on to evaluate evidence based on all their training and experience that the court lacks the expertise to do. The expert will then express an opinion as to the significance of the findings only after they have been deemed to be an expert in the area. It's not like the lay person who can only attest to things that they have seen, things that they have touched, things that they have smelled, but they can only testify on observations that arise from their personal knowledge. In the U.S. court case, Melendez-Diaz versus Massachusetts, the decision addressed the practice of using evidence affidavits or laboratory certificates in lieu of in-person testimony. In its reasoning, the court relied on a previous ruling, Crawford versus Washington, where it explored the meaning of the Confrontation Clause of the Sixth Amendment. In the Crawford case, a recorded statement by a spouse was used against her husband in his prosecution. Crawford argued that this was a violation of his rights to confront witnesses against him under the Sixth Amendment, and the court agreed. Using the same logic in Melendez-Diaz, the court reasoned that introducing forensic science evidence via an affidavit or a certificate denied a defendant the opportunity to cross-examine the analyst. In Fry versus United States, the court stated the following: when a scientific principle or discovery crosses the line between the experimental and demonstrable stages is difficult to define. Somewhere in this, as they say, twilight zone, the evidential force of the principle must be recognized, and while the courts will go a long way in admitting expert testimony deduced from a well-recognized scientific principle of discovery, the thing from which the deduction is made must be significantly established to have gained general acceptance in the particular field in which it belongs. In other words, to meet this Fry standard, the court must decide whether the question, procedure, technique, or principle is generally accepted by a meaningful segment of the relevant scientific community. In practice, this approach required the proponent of a scientific test to present to the court, a collection of experts who could testify that the scientific issue before the court is generally accepted by the relevant members of the scientific community. In a landmark ruling in 1993, the case of Danbert versus Merrill Dow Pharmaceutical, Inc., the U.S. Supreme Court asserted that general acceptance, or the Fry standard, is not an absolute prerequisite to the admissibility of scientific evidence under the Federal Rules of Evidence. According to the court, the rules of evidence, especially Rule 702, assign to the trial judge the task of ensuring that an expert's testimony results on a reliable foundation and it's relevant to the case. Although this ruling applies only to federal courts, many state courts are expected and have adopted this guideline. When the court advocates in Danbert said is that the trial judge assumes the ultimate responsibility for acting as a gatekeeper in judging the admissibility and reliability of scientific evidence presented in their courts. In Daubert, the Supreme Court offered some guidelines as to how a judge can gauge scientific evidence. 1, whether the scientific technique or theory can be or has been tested. 2, whether the technique or theory has been subject to peer review and publication. 3, the technique's potential rate of error. 4, existence and maintenance of standards controlling the technique's operation. And lastly, 5, whether the scientific theory or method has attracted widespread acceptance within a relevant scientific community. A number of special forensic science services are available to law enforcement communities to augment the services of specific crime labs. These services are not usually part of the crime lab, but are parts of the different police departments and sometimes of the FBI. These services include forensic psychiatry, where you do profiling. Forensic odontology is where you look at bite marks. Computer science and forensic engineering. Forensic psychiatry is a specialized area in which the relationship between human behavior and legal proceedings is examined. These type of psychiatrists are retained for both civil and criminal litigations. For civil cases, forensic psychiatrists normally determine whether people are competent to make decisions about preparing wills, selling property, refusing medical treatment. For criminal cases, they evaluate behavior disorders and determine whether people are competent to stand trial. Forensic odontology involves using teeth to provide information about the identification of victims when a body is left in an unrecognizable state, and also investigate bite marks. A lot of times forensic odontology are used with dental records, and then it can actually help prove, as in the case of Ted Bundy, about teeth marks and bite marks. One example is the picture on A is actually a bite mark of a victim. And number 2 is showing the suspect's sample bite mark that was taken. Forensic engineers are concerned with failure analysis, accident reconstruction, and causes and origins of fire or explosives. Forensic engineers answer questions such as, how did an accident or structural failure occur? Were the parties involved responsible? And if so, how were they responsible? Accident scenes are examined, photographs are reviewed, and any mechanical objects involved are inspected. The forensic computer and digital analysis science is a new and fast-growing field that involves the identification, collection, preservation, and examination of information derived from computers and other digital devices, such as cell phones. Law enforcement aspects of this work normally involve the recovery of deleted or overwritten data from a computer's hard drive and the tracking of hacking addresses. Many crime laboratories have evidence technicians, as I said, does HPD, trained by the crime lab staff on 24-hour call for evidence collection at crime scenes. Their training ensures all pertinent evidence will be recognized and collected properly. Even though the detective assigned to the crime scene is in charge, they rely heavily on the crime scene evidence technicians. Familiarity can be gained through lectures, tours of the lab, and evidence collection manuals. Documentation Examination Unit studies the handwriting and typewriting on questioned documents to look at authenticity and/or the resource. Photographic Unit applies specialized high techniques used as digital imaging, infrared, ultraviolet, and X-ray photos.